Welcome to this event. My name is Nick Caldry. I'm the head of LSE's Department of Media and Communications, and I'm delighted to chair today a very special event where we launch and celebrate two remarkable books, both published by New York University Press as part of an exciting new series on communications and connected youth, which we also launch in public today. One of the books is By Any Media Necessary by Henry Jenkins and his colleagues, which was written from the Annenberg School for Communications at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. And this book continues Henry's research into convergence culture, which began with the very well-known book of that name in 2006 and has continued with a number of other books. This new book, which I was privileged to see and discuss in manuscript form, represents the latest stage in his thinking about how the resources of a digital media age provide, under particular conditions, researched extensively in the book, new opportunities for collaboration, whether to playful or serious ends, and in particular provide the meeting grounds where new ways of engaging with the civic and political realm can be imagined. It has a number of fascinating case studies which take head-on the contradiction between claims that democracy is in crisis versus the explosion of inventiveness in democratic practice that we in fact see all around us. And he rejects, as many of us here at LSE do, the idea that youth is failing democracy. And he offers a rich model with his co-authors of the many levels on which we need to research empirically the intersections between culture and politics, culture and democracy. And the book for me is remarkably successful in tracking the increasing richness in how voices today can become entangled with other voices in the space that's enabled by convergent media, with important and sometimes transformative consequences. The second book that we launched today is The Class, and copies, of course, of both are at the back, and you will be able to buy them later. The Class, Living and Learning in the Digital Age by Sonia, Livingstone and Julian Sefton-Green. Where the strength of the first book is the plurality of case studies, this second book is, for me, remarkable for the intense concentration of its fieldwork conducted over 1 year with a single class in a North London secondary school. Not only was the sample broad in terms of socioeconomic resource, ethnicity and media resources, the levels on which Sonia and Julian engaged with this class were multiple, from regular class observations, out-of-class events, multiple interviews with the young people, their parents, their teachers, observation at home, and many exercises to grasp these young people's sense of self, their sense of connection, their visions for the future. And like Henry's book, this book too leaves far behind crude arguments that youth are simply a problem for society. Through the way the research articulates the sites of home and school, this book is particularly sensitive to how the process of individualization, so often glibly talked about, actually works today. Its promises, its painful pressures and risks. And they avoid hyping the contribution of the digital while registering the many ways in which media resources enable not just connection, but also perhaps spaces of temporary disconnection, spaces of relief from the highly regulated environment of an ordinary English school. So I'm excited to hear the links between these two wonderful books that will emerge in the discussion. And now let me introduce our speakers more formally. Henry Jenkins is Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Arts and Education at the University of Southern California. Sonia Livingstone is Professor of Social Psychology at LSE's Department of Media and Communications. Julian Sefton-Green is Principal Research Fellow, also in LSE's Department of Media and Communications, and he's also Associate Professor at the University of Oslo, and he's General Editor of the wider Communications and Connected Youth series at New York University Press. And we're delighted also today to have as respondent to the author's presentations Pat Thompson, who is Professor of Education at the University of Nottingham. Now, the format of today's events will be as follows. First, Julian will briefly introduce the book series of which both books we're launching today form part. Then we will have 20 minutes of comment on each book, first from Henry, then from Sonia and Julian. Pat will respond for around 10 minutes we will probably have a few minutes for immediate responses from the panel, and then I'll open it up for questions and general discussion, probably for around half an hour. We don't have to end exactly at 6 because we're continuing the dialogue in party form afterwards. So to get us started, let me turn to Julian, who will introduce the books series. Julian.
Just keep a long way from the mic. So thank you very much for your very kind and generous introduction, Nick, and I want to thank you all very much for being here. It's quite a thrill for us, having worked on these books in this series for a long time, and then suddenly there are lots of people, which is a bit of an odd experience, really. And I do feel a little bit diffident introducing the series, given I'm one of the co-authors of one of the volumes, and the series only consists of 2 volumes, so I just wanted to make the point that I'm not normally as self-centered as it might appear mathematically by the numbers here. But we wanted very much to draw attention to the fact that this is a new series called Connected Youth and Digital Futures, which comes out of the work which has been funded by the MacArthur Foundation's support for a large-scale initiative called Digital Media Learning, which I know many of you will know about, which has resulted in a range of different projects, both research projects. Sonia and I are members of a network called the Connected Learning Research Network. Henry is a member of a sister network called the Young People's Political Participation, YPP. But MacArthur has also funded a range of on-the-ground projects for young people in informal learning settings, huge communications and publicity resource. It's now developing MOOCs for learning for people interested in the philosophy and practices of connected learning. And the aim of the series is to help provide some academic ballast to this raft of local initiatives, local projects, which of course have their own tensions and histories and trajectories. And the purpose of the series, and I will read, is to shed light onto the day-to-day lives and futures of young people as they're being reconfigured at the intersection of civil and political reform, transformations in employment and education, and the development and penetration of digital technologies across all domains of social and personal life. The books in the series, and there are 2 more forthcoming, hopefully next year, one by Minnie Ito and colleagues, and one by Craig Watkins and his colleagues from the University of Texas, Minnie from the University of California, aim to look at new kinds of institutions, for lack of a better language, and the different kinds of places that are emerging for young people as kind of traditional civic, educational and formal institutions shift and collapse in our contemporary times. The books are particularly interested in exploring the agency of young people, claims made for the agency of young people, and indeed, of course, study of the constraints that may impinge on the agency of young people. And thirdly, all the volumes of the series and the initiative is interested in what might broadly be described as the changing nature of learning or education, as we all come to terms with what it means to think, act, and feel in the new digital age. So that's the broad principles of the series, and one of the great things about the support is they are, despite the fact you're all going to go and buy copies at the back, is they are of course available online with open access, so it's your choice. And now, with great pleasure, I'm going to hand over to Henry, and he's going to talk in more detail about the book that he authored with him, Summit Scholars.
I am a Muslim American, and I am just like you. I was born and raised in this country. I work in this country. I believe in this country, and I pray for the safety of this country. I am an American through and through, and I'm also a Muslim. And as a Muslim, I believe that there's only one God, and that Prophet Muhammad was his messenger. I believe in 5 pillars: the declaration of my faith, prayer, pilgrimage, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and charity. These 5 pillars are the framework of Islam, and notice how they don't include violence or terror. I never thought I would make this video and talk about something so personal. Faith is such an intimate subject, and never in a million years did I think I would be sitting in front of a camera sharing my experience as a Muslim today. But the current social environment for Muslims today is not safe or just. Hate crimes against Muslims have increased dramatically over the past several weeks, and as a Muslim American, I felt like I needed to use my voice. When these tragedies occur, we Muslims are just as saddened as our fellow Americans. And we're heartbroken that there are people out there that manipulate our texts to serve their own sick, twisted agenda. After 9/11, a few of my friends told me that they were no longer allowed to hang out with me because I was Muslim. And that was one of my first brushes with Islamophobia, and it was the first time that I had felt outcasted for who I was. I was 9. I remember being called a terrorist. I remember watching my dad be told to go back where he came from. Now we have businesses refusing to serve Muslims. We have protests against Muslims, against the building of mosques, against the education on Islamophobia, against just the mere mention of Malala Yousafzai and her attack by the Taliban. We have a presidential candidate whose loudest message reeks of hatred and Islamophobia. We have a cultural landscape in America today that frightens me to my very core. Turning on the news now is scary and oftentimes humiliating because the topics now include bizarre concepts like Muslims wearing ID tags or mosques being closed down nationwide. Going online now is the most eye-opening experience as I see tweets, statuses, and articles openly sharing their disdain for my community. Honestly, the hypocrisy around me is so loud that it's deafening. When the Westboro Baptist Church pickets funerals and events with their hate speech in the name of God, their actions are not considered representative of Christianity as a whole. With the KKK still in existence with their hate speech and white supremacist agenda, their actions are not considered representative of Christianity as a whole. When there are mass shootings in this country by Christian white males, we as a nation are able to recognize that the individual does not represent Christianity. When there are attacks on abortion clinics by Christian extremists, we are able to separate the extremist from the moderate Christian and move on conveniently to the next topic. But for some reason, this same logical approach and respect cannot be reciprocated for the Muslim community. I cannot begin to understand why it seems oppressive for my mother to be wearing a hijab, but noble for a nun to be covered from head to toe. To me, both are beautiful in their modesty, but in America today, one is a symbol of extremism and oppression, while another is a symbol of piousness and self-respect. I spent my entire education singing mandatory Christmas carols in my school chorus with respect and excitement. Today, I learned that a school in Virginia shut down after a homework assignment asking students to recreate Arabic calligraphy in order to understand and appreciate its complexity. The Arabic language isn't a dangerous disease, so why is it being treated like one?
That gives you a sense of the sort of quality of this video. It's a spectacular example of a young person finding voice, and that voice moving from the cultural realm into the political realm. Now, I wanted to share, so allow me to talk a little bit about the work of my colleague Sangeeta Shrestova, who is one of the co-authors of this book and did the case study for the book on American Muslim youth. And she writes there about what's happened, the degree to which American Muslim youth in America after 9/11 are always already politicized. To be in public is to be forced to defend and justify your religious beliefs. That there is no clear separation that these young people are finding between being in their culture, in their community, practicing their religion, and being political agents. But there are degrees to which they find their courage to speak out and describe and educate and challenge the dominant discourses of their time. And in this we see attacks on critiques of the news media, critiques of local communities, critiques of schools, all of which contribute, she believes, to the climate of Islamophobia. American Muslim youth have been among the most active using social media and video sharing platforms to share their own experiences, tell their own stories, but they've done so in a context of surveillance. Surveillance from governmental sources, surveillance from haters, surveillance from members of their own community who want to police what it is to be a proper Islamic girl and what she should or shouldn't do. I wanted to share this video this week because of Orlando and the ways in which the Islamic community and LGBT community are right now being pit against each other, and that brings together some of the kinds of political concerns we heard often from young people. I see this video, as I said, as an example of voice, as Nick Couldry defines it in some of his writing, giving an account of yourself for the purpose of making change, getting other people to think about you and your group differently. Now, by any means necessary, we interviewed more than 200 activists. We have 5 core case studies beyond American Muslim. We also deal with invisible children. We deal with fan activism around Harry Potter Alliance, Imagine Better, and the Nerd Fighters. We deal with the Dreamer movement for undocumented youth, and we deal with American libertarian youth. So we try for a range of perspectives, from traditional identity politics groups to new kinds of activism that are organizing around fandom. But we heard similar things coming across all of them. At the core, my book is optimistic, and anyone who knows my writing knows that I have to own that because I can't be anything other than the optimist I am. But it's written also with a critical engagement with the fact that many of the young people we talk to feel American democracy and institutions are fundamentally broken. They're deeply skeptical of the political system. They could rattle off all kinds of problems of inequality of access to non-representative structures, to rule systems that make it difficult for challenging candidates to get the nomination, and so forth. They would be the first to say that this is not about a system that's working as if anyone intended it to, but it is how they are using social media, new video sharing, other practices to work around media concentration, non-representative voting practices, and seeing the cultural as a side of change. Julian and Sonia and I have been back and forth on a piece that's ran in my blog last week, and one of the things at the end of it, the 2 books are framed as mine's about exceptional youth, exceptional practices. And theirs is about a more typical experience of a specific group of youth. And I'll own that up to a certain point. I mean, we've been talking about young people that made a difference. We are talking about exceptions to a norm that often silences the voices of youth and doesn't allow them to be found political. The young people, the movements we're looking at have been successes. The young people we look at are young people who've been stood out in those movements as articulate representatives of that movement. That's important to pay attention to. It's important to acknowledge that. At the same time, though, what we're seeing is young people are using some of the same types of practices we're documenting in growing numbers, right? The YPP network did some large-scale surveys to get a snapshot of where young people are at, and they found that basically 56% of youth have not committed a political act in the last year, as they define politics. Those numbers, by the way, are not radically different than adult numbers, right? This is American political participation is a problem. But it also means that 44% of young people have committed political acts of one sort or another in the last year. This was at a midterm election. I think if we had done the survey now, we would see much greater numbers in terms of participation. We're often told that online politics substitutes for quote, real politics, or what we call institutional politics. But what we find is young people who participate online are twice as likely to participate through more institutionalized political processes. It's often the entry point as they find their voice, discover what it is like to stay in a broader movement, and carry those skills over to alignment with more institutional forms of politics. And that's a really important dimension of this. We're also seeing it online there, we're seeing closing up of some of the gaps racially in American politics. In terms of the voting, there's about a 17% gap between African-American youth and Latino youth. African-American most likely to vote, Latino youth least likely to vote. When we look at online political activity, that closes to about 4 or 5%. So if that online is a predictor of likely future political change, then the online will have been a space where many youth of color in particular found their voice and moved into politics. Now, she's also not typical insofar as she's not what political scientists call the usual suspects. That is, young people are most likely to be political if their parents are political, if they have teachers in a civics class who brings in current events or encourage them to go to government hearings, if they participate in after-school clubs or in newspaper debates, student government, if they do volunteerism in community organizations. We're finding, though, that the online world opens gateways to participation for young people who are not of those groups, who would not have been political otherwise. And they often start with them finding some cultural sweet spot, something they're really passionate about. In some cases, it may be fandom. In some cases, it may be gaming. In this case, it was makeup, right? And critiquing the beauty culture around white women in American society by creating a makeup program for Muslim women was already transgressive in a cultural sense. But her finding the way that opened the door, she found an audience that then opens the door for her to be political as well. If we looked at these kids in middle school, almost none of them would look like they were going to be politically active. So that's where the comparison to your work seems really important to me. There's plenty of things blocking these young people from being political. There's something that's happening in their lives from middle school to young adulthood that is allowing them to become political. And that's what we're trying to understand. The young researchers in our network who look at isolated youth, individual youth, are not finding those transitions. They often experiment with political voice, make one or two things, get shut down or ignored, and move on. They may start to bracket their political identities from their online communities and not talking about them there. They may stop being political altogether. There's a kind of moment of crisis for young people. What we're seeing is the kind of organizations and networks we write about in the book are successful at tapping something, providing the infrastructure for them to communicate effectively, guaranteeing a community they're speaking to and with, helping orientate rhetorical practices and helping them identify pressure points. These organizations do important work to link them together. These are what connected learning calls consequential connections. It's about the scaffolding providing young people. So without that scaffolding, most young people would not become political. With that scaffolding, something transformative is taking place. So we're trying to understand what that is. Often the online world is described as without risk, but if you looked at the comments that this young woman has gotten on the video, she faced enormous pushback. The haters hate her. The online attacks on Muslims are there, the critiques from her own community, but she remains strong in that, has continued to produce videos, has continued to be politically engaged, and she's found her way into institutional politics. I'm not going to show it here, but she was one of a series of young people chosen by Fox News, of all places, to ask a question during one of the Republican presidential debates. She asked a question of Jeb Bush about Islamophobia. He punted on the Islamophobia part, but used it to critique Trump's views on Muslims instead. But it's an interesting moment to see this woman go from a makeup guru to someone speaking politically for the first time publicly, to someone who is fully part of the political process. And I think if we understand what's happened in US politics in the last year or so, the Bernie movement being a prime example, we're seeing young people are out there protesting, participating, voting in record numbers right now. And there are many of the issues on their agenda have found their way into the Democratic debate. And interestingly enough, around the Republican debates, many of the American Muslim activists that Sangeeta interviewed a few years back are now being on air as commentators, responding to the Republican discourse on anti-Muslim discourse through mainstream media. So we're seeing this at the end of a process, or the end of the movement to the next stage of that process. And with that, I will wrap things up.
Okay, Henry, thank you, and Nick for your introduction, and everyone here for coming. So Julian and I are going to do a kind of a double act around our book, in which I'm going to say a little about why we wrote the book. He's going to say something about how we did the work. I'll do a little bit of the what we found, and he's going to do a bit of the so what at the end. Is this okay? Can you hear? Yeah, good, all right. So the class, Living and Learning in the Digital Age. It's a story of a year in the life of a class of 28, 13 to 14-year-olds in a suburban London school, but a suburban London school these days is a very multi-ethnic mixed place. And we tried to do what, when there are no anthropologists in the room, I might call a multi-sited ethnography, but there are some, so I'll be cautious. But we followed these teenagers at home, at school, online, with their friends. And we wanted to understand how they negotiate the pressures opportunities and constraints of the different worlds that they're part of. So one interest, since I'm in the Department of Media and Communication, is how digital technology is woven into the fabric of their personal, social and learning lives, whether it's for better or for worse. Another was to try to contest and examine the utopian and dystopian hyperbole about the transformations that these technologies are meant to bring about in their life, but at the same time we would like to out the rhetoric of the digital age that surrounds young people and also surround the argumentation in our book. Because the bottom line is that the lives of the children that we worked with are not so different from the lives that we lived as children of all the different generations represented here. Family, school, friends, they're very immediate locale. These remain the most important places for young people. Their lives were often humdrum, their concerns were often commonplace, but yes, they have digital media in their hands, in their ears, in their pockets, on their screens at school, everywhere in their lives. And that kind of contradiction between the familiar and the new is what we wanted to try to grasp. So some have asked why I wanted to write this book in particular, especially since previously I've been doing a very large-scale survey, and I think I've enjoyed the oscillation between the qual and the quantitative approaches. But I think what I see in common across the work that I've been doing, and what I really think we wanted to bring to this book, is an effort to see people's lives in the round. Yes, it's the digital age quote. Yes, it's the media age. But how do we kind of put that together with all the other sites and institutions and contexts that structure people as they, in their everyday lives, move from the public to the private and back to the public, and the two infuse each other, and as they themselves are thinking about and grappling with questions about how digital media are kind of reconfiguring the possibilities, but also the problems that they encounter. So it was exciting to be invited into this MacArthur-funded network that Henry and others have been working in, often addressing a kind of bottom line question of whether schools are broken, whether there's something wrong with the way in which we're bringing up children and young people and allowing them learning opportunities, whether there are ways in which digital and informal learning opportunities can compensate for some of the failures of our institutions. But in that debate, I think what many of us in this research have wanted to do is really prioritise and hear from the voices and the experiences of those young people. So as Henry said, in the class we very much focused on the ordinary as a counterpoint to the extraordinary young people that are sometimes celebrated or worried about in today's society. But we focus on the ordinary not to homogenise, but precisely to unpack the diversity of those who are, even among 28 kids in one class, an extraordinarily diverse group. We were interested in the ways in which schools and home we could see have their problems, but at least in the UK we would not say are broken. So we wanted to see how their lives engage with the institutions that define their possibilities. And we were fascinated by the way in which home is kind of invisible to the teachers in the school, and school is kind of invisible to the parents at home. And what links them are traditionally the children going back and forth, and increasingly, possibly, the digital networks that kind of embrace and connect both. And one of the kind of bottom line findings that we contended with was the ways in which the children especially, but also the parents and the teachers sought to create disconnections rather than always find ways of fostering further connections. So I was going to say more about theory, but I won't. I'm going to hand over to Julian because I've got a stopwatch here which is ticking away, and I'm going to let you say something about how.
Okay, so retrospectively, the plan of doing 5 minutes talking about each may not have been the best plan in the world. Okay, so Sonia has described some of the very ambitious kind of ideas about looking at the whole of young people's lives or that kind of thing. And we did spend the best part of the year, the two of us, with this class of 28-ish kids. I say 28-ish because kids in schools come and go, and that's an important factor. So how do we translate these large-scale theoretical ambitions to sort of look at the texture of kids' everyday lives, to look at the way that they form identity, to investigate what it means to be educated, to think about new kinds of learning, to look at the new kinds of spaces, to look at the kind of institutional practices, the demands and resources that are played in young people's lives. How do we take those big ideas and translate them into a research practice, and how do we create a narrative that has any sense of plausibility or credibility, and we hope that you will find it's doing that. So what we did was the key for us in some senses was to find a way of building up trust amongst the young people over the period of the year. So to begin with, we just spent time with them in school. Young people in school are used to surveillance adults just being around and being in their spaces. They're not encouraged to ask questions about why you want to find out about them and all the rest of it. So we started off simply occupying that role, and then gradually built up a sense of individual relationship with the individual members of the class over time, and began talking to them. And one of the really interesting things about the process was that it's very difficult for us to know the truth of this, but they appeared to like talking to us. So why would they like talking to us? Why would 25 ordinary children want to talk to two professors from the MSc? Well, partly we think it's because of the sense of a disinterested broker in their lives, which isn't something which is very common in young people's experiences. So we spent the time with them in school and built up some sense of their behaviours, their interests, their attitudes, their social interactions with other people, with adults, in the playground, which you can see there in case you haven't been to a school in some time, in class, with their peers, with their friends and all the rest of it. And then we, and as you can see, the school, as is very common in English schools, has uniforms. So there was one of the things that is very kind of prominent in the book and is very obvious about the way in which young people live their lives is how they are scrutinised and subjected to forms of what Foucault would call biopower, that their bodies are scrutinised and controlled in extraordinary details. And I think the pair of us were quite struck by this and how what is called longer-term impacts were on the formation of identity, personal relationships, private space in that kind of surveillance kind of world. After we spent time with them in school, we went home with them and we did a media tour with them in the house. We got them to take photographs of all the technology in the house. We had a very robust discussion between the pair of us. What does that mean? Okay. About the role of digital media, because we very much didn't want to fall into a media effects trap where we would prioritise and isolate the variability of the media in some way, and tried to look very much at how media is absolutely part of the warp and woof and texture of everyday life. And that's, I think, one of the achievements that we're quite pleased at in the book. You'll be there to judge that. We spent time with them in their homes, we talked to their parents, as Sonia said, we did some social network analysis, and Sonia will talk about that in more detail. We then went back to young people who had particular kinds of interests, so we went on play dates as they played computer games, we went with them to their music lessons, kids that played the piano, private lessons in middle class homes, or the Turkish child that went to the Alevi Music Centre in a much rougher part of town. And then finally we went back to them after the year to get some sense of retrospection through some form of exit interviews. So we built up and amassed a huge variety of data that allowed us to try and create this sort of portraiture in the way that we hope we've achieved.
It's a horror to try to fit a book into 20 minutes. And 1 year in the kids' lives, but I think 5 years in our lives. So a few pictures of the variety and diversity of young people's lives and the technologies they live with. Okay, I want to show you one image which may or may not make any sense to you, but it's one of the images that Julian and I argued about the most. And it's the way in which we try to understand the life of the class as a network within the class and a network beyond the class. And this is, of course, the age of digital networks, but the history of social networks is as old as humanity, so our question is, in a way, what difference does the underpinning of digital networks make to the social networks that exist in and across sites, and does it help to enable connections across different sites? So, oh joy. probably can't see a thing except here are the children and they are all connected to each other in complicated ways that means nothing to you because you don't know them, and everything to us. So a nice example perhaps of how the fieldwork unfolds and becomes meaningful where initially there seemed to be no meaning. This was relationships and communities are built through micro-interaction every day, constructed through repeated small actions. And this network was the result of asking 28 kids in the class, who in the class are your friends, who helps you with homework, who do you hang out with, who do you turn to when you have a problem, and then we mapped, as it were, the network that underpins what you cannot see when you just see all of them sitting neatly in their rows. So this is a school where the child of a refugee sits next to the child of a millionaire, and a kind of civility is created in the classroom, which was one of the things that we found fascinating. And there was a commonality and a very deliberate effort on the part of the teacher, but also on the part of the children, to create a sense that everyone was together in this, and the differences of those who sat next to each other didn't matter. But when we ask the questions, who do you hang out with, turn to when you have a problem, and so forth, a patterning emerges, which, if I were to decode this very rapidly, is to say, in the centre of the network, densely connected to many people, we have a bunch of kids who are largely popular middle-class boys. To one side of the network, we have a group of more of the poorer boys from the ethnic minorities. To the far side, we have a group of the largely poorer girls, also from ethnic minorities. We have two girls stuck out on their own, labelled by the school as gifted and talented. And we have two popular girls here with very good connections to all of the boys. And so we see a kind of self-assorting that lies beneath a very strong and shared commitment to civility, but it's not total. And one of the groups that fascinated us here was a demographically mixed group who cohered around Harry Potter, I hope Henry is pleased to know. And their fandom allowed them to overcome various kinds of societal sortings. The Facebook, we did ask who are you connected to on Facebook, and it was impossible to draw because everyone was connected to everyone with just a couple of exceptions, so the whole image would become black. But the Facebook was another space of civility, another space in which people, as they were in the classroom face to face, were courteous to all. Everyone is connected, everyone is included. So it was kind of politely normative on Facebook. And then there were other online spaces that lay beneath that, of other kinds of social media or gaming sites that permitted a different differentiation that was, again, in some ways demographic, a matter of social reproduction, and in other ways allowed for new kinds of patternings and experimentation with different kinds of relationships. So the reason we argued was that that was the pattern within the class, but within the class wasn't necessarily the kid's most important space. So if I take one girl who was on the edge of the network and say, okay, Dilruba, who are your friends, who do you turn to when you have a problem, who do you ask for help with homework, we have a different pattern in which nearly everyone she names is not in the class, because her important people are elsewhere and her friends are elsewhere, and those she turns to for the rest of her life are centred somewhere else. And so the class is a key space, and it's a social space of construction of civility. It puts her a bit on the edge, but that's because she is the centre of something else. Take another child, Gideon, who I'm only going to tell you about, 2, not all 28. Gideon was right in the very centre of those popular middle-class boys. When we drew his, and he had the most Facebook friends of anyone, and the most in-class friends of anyone. But look at Gideon. When we ask him who's important, it says granddad, granddad, other granddad, dad, mum, sister, cousins. He seems to be the popular kid in the class holding together all of those kind of dramas that we like as adults to project onto the lives of children. But actually, he's centred at home. And the reason, as we came to know him, and it's horrible summarising lives in 2 sentences, but the reason turned out to be a kind of fragile and emotionally up and down struggle through his life, in which he had become very rooted and stayed very rooted to those who he knew really supported him. And then he goes to school and he creates this pose of social success and connectivity, which is online and offline, and is a certain kind of experimentation. But is, as it were, a projection of a possible self that he strives for when his real life is thoroughly grounded elsewhere.
So just in the last couple of minutes, to try and think a bit about the so what question, as Sonia put it. Throughout the book, we played with three words, partly because they're literated and partly because we have an inflated view of our own literary brilliance. And they are competitive, conservative, and connected. And we wanted to tease out the meaning of each of those terms throughout, over the year and within the class. By competitive, we were particularly struck by the ways in which, in a fearful, risk, anxious social world, the education system and young people's lives is being driven into more and more forms of kind of competition, significantly competition for employment that no longer exists. And therefore the point of learning and qualifications takes on a different kind of meaning. By conservative, we were very struck by the rationality of the cautious and conservative, obviously with a small c, kind of decisions that families and young people made about their relationships, about their aspirations, about their activities, and how different that was in some ways from other generations where we perhaps more used to forms of resistance and sometimes open kind of rebellion in different kinds of other kinds of times. And by connected, and this was perhaps the term that most vexed us throughout the whole of the book, we know that these, and we tracked and we enlisted in numerous detail how connected in technological terms these young people are, and how forms of connectivity and connection play a key part in their day-to-day lives. So the social network is not just about Facebook, but as Sonia showed us, about meaningful kinds of relationships. We were absolutely struck by how all the different the key three social domains we investigated, home, school, and peer life, how they all worked much harder to sustain boundaries and forms of disconnection than allowed themselves to be kind of interpenetrated through forms of connectivity, which broke down the value of discrete private worlds in that kind of way. So the school did not want to have anything to do with Facebook for a huge range of reasons, and there's some almost funny stories in the book about that. Young people did not want parents and teachers, in a sense, to kind of investigate, to be able to see into their lives after the school day. And indeed, the school was very happy to make sure that technology didn't work and boundaries didn't work. The forms of network connectivity that we did observe were very much geared towards kind of everyday life and real-world, real-time social interactions. We were much more persuaded by the surveillance corporate features of technology, the way that they were used by the school as forms of, if not surveillance, and kind of data gathering about the young people in that kind of way, rather than the kind of forms of individual possibility and expressivity that many people have argued the technology kind of facilitates. So throughout the book, we kind of tried to interrogate those three terms: competitive, conservative, and connected. And we were much more struck by I think, true to say, we didn't expect to find as many disconnections and to see the kind of positive value of the disconnections in some ways, as opposed to the kind of seemingly kind of blind kind of march towards a kind of completely transparent, interconnected world. And the final thing I want to say is that I think we got quite emotionally engaged with the young people. You do when you go with young people, if you have a heart. Over the year. And we were absolutely struck by the kind of microscopic tragedies that took place kind of every day in that kind of way. And I have no idea whether in a book like this or we can do anything about that, or whether that's the way social reproduction works. So we were really struck by the fact we ended up finding out about young people across these different domains in the way that the normal kind of owners of those domains didn't know. So parents don't know what kids do at school. Teachers don't know what kids do at home. They've got all the funny ideas, and vice versa. And kids don't want anybody to know what they do in outer space, for, as I said, I think unreasonable reasons. But the result of this is a kind of a tragedy of small-scale effects, where if the Turkish boy, who was an unbelievably zealous and hard-working Saz, which is a kind of rooty thing, player, if this fact was known to the teachers who just thought he was a clown and never had any discipline for anything, could it have made a difference to his learning? We don't know. And those little sort of moments and those kind of little sadnesses about the failures of connection and connectivity made us more enthusiastic for forms of connection and crossing those boundaries, just as, in some senses, what we observed was a remorseless march to kind of increase disconnection and disconnectivity.
It seems particularly apposite to be discussing these two books at this time, really, because we've not only had Orlando but also the murder of Joe Cox, and for anybody who watched the BBC debate last night, what seemed to be the ripping away of a kind of veneer of civility, if only we had more civility, in fact, last night, and certainly from kind of Australian sort of post-colonial perspective, bizarrely, we from the Commonwealth do get to vote in referendum. What seemed to be very old, ongoing kind of beating of a sort of white colonial view of the world, it seems particularly appropriate to be discussing two books which really do raise questions, I think, in the broader sense about what kind of world we want and what kind of world young people want. I think anthropologists, I think in particular the anthropologist Tim Ingold suggests that, you know, the point of anthropology is not to do ethnography, it is in fact to raise questions about the world, and I think that is in fact what this ethnography does, and certainly the point of the book on activism. And I think the book, The Class, really looks at the kind of way in which, and Julian's been talking about, the way in which the institution of schooling, which has a kind of generational transmission, you know, of the things that matter, what it's actually doing and to what ends. So I think it is, as I say, particularly kind of apposite moment to be thinking about the world as it is through the lives of young people and their kind of experiences, not simply with digital media, but also with their friends and families and their broader kind of connections. First of all, I'm going to say a couple of things about each of the books, and then I just want to raise some kind of questions that struck me. I want to note to start with the problem with being given the mission to challenge is that you very often end up talking about what the books haven't done as opposed to what they have. And so I do, you know, want to start by saying that, you know, I think The Class is in a kind of a fine tradition of ethnography. I mean, in both Britain and the US, there are wonderful ethnographies of different kinds. Britain has a particular kind of history of educational ethnography, of very close observations of what happens in schools, and also what happens around young people's literary practices, and that is also the case in the US. And I think you see those traditions kind of being honoured here in the book The Class. I understand it has been put into Laurie Taylor's competition. I really wish her well. I think it's a nice book from a methodological point of view for a couple of reasons. One, because it is written, self-consciously written, I think, and I briefly had a word with Sonia beforehand. You know, Julian and Sonia did kind of consciously think about how it is you provide that kind of rich texture through description. And I think it will be interesting for people to look at from that perspective how it's written. But it also provides very helpful, I think, particularly for people who are learning about research and research design. I think it provides a very helpful set of information about the decisions that were made and about how the research was designed. And that's both at the beginning of the book and at the end in the appendix. And so it's worth picking up, not simply, I think, for its substance, but also for its kind of methodological contribution and what it contributes to research craft. I think it does achieve its kind of aim of puncturing some of the kind of dominant myths not simply about, you know, the way in which young people engage with the digital, but also the bigger kind of sociological narratives about risk and reflexivity and kind of sharp disjunctions between what used to be the case and what happens now. So, you know, and for me, of course, as an education researcher, the most telling chapter was the one on levels. In fact, when you do this, you always end up talking about yourself, don't you? I apologise for this, but it does dovetail with some research that I've been involved with and something that I've published about a lesson a day, in fact, in the life of young people, and that kind of forensic actuarial process that goes on in schools. And I think you're rather kinder about what the national bills actually might do than I feel. I feel quite desperate about the way in which everything has to be levelled and young people understand their education only in terms of, you know, whether they're a 5 or a 6 or an A or a B or a whatever. It just seems to me to be completely a terrible way to actually approach anything, whether it's a lesson or in fact a life in schools. If I just turn now to the by any media necessary, I didn't read this book as a researcher particularly. In fact, I read it as an old activist myself, having been a card-carrying member of what used to be called the SEA, which was the kind of Australian version of the American SDS in the US. So some of you, I'm sure, understand what that is. And so clearly my own past is rooted in the kind of student movement and the similarity, of course, in the US and Australia about young people being conscripted to go and fight in Vietnam, the kind of process that happened around that. And being editor of a university student newspaper at the time, I was actually struck by the kind of commonalities between a lot of the things that happened then in the kind of student movement and what the young people today were attempting with different kinds of affordances. But I think that the notion, I think the scepticism about formal institutions, the understanding that culture is an arena of activity, I think there is continuity, I think, between the kind of 60s and early 70s and the kind of activism that young people have now. I did find myself having a little fantasy about how nice it might be to actually have a project in which there was an intergenerational conversation between the kind of young activists today and those of us who were very politically active in the late 60s and 70s, and wondering, of course, whether we could teach them anything about the way in which our efforts fractured and fragmented. And of course I'm mindful there of work by people like Mafisoli's work on the kind of identity tribes, and Sheila Rowbottom's book about the kind of fracturing, and then the Thatcherite experience here in the UK, which swept its way through lots of different kinds of activist organisations. But I found myself, as I put the two books together, I found myself having another kind of internal conversation. And it's interesting to read the two books side by side, and it's interesting to read them from an Australian perspective, because Australia's a kind of funny kind of hybrid really between Britain and the US. I think there are things about Australia that are like most places. But I found myself wondering what the class would look like if it was conducted in the US, and what by any media necessary would look like if it was conducted in the UK, and what might be the differences. And it reminded me this week that the EU referendum has in fact been vigorously debated in schools, that schools have taken the opportunity to, which they're usually not allowed to, I have to say, but teachers have seized the opportunity to, in a lot of places, to actually have political debates in the kind of space of the school about what the EU referendum means. But in the public arena, the voice of young people has been very silenced, I think, and there's a bit of information around about the, surveys of young people who are strongly pro-Europe, but there's been very little that you actually kind of see. And I did go on a bit of a bit of a YouTube hunt and a bit of a Twitter trawl to see what I could see. So there seemed a funny kind of reversal here just in the last couple of weeks around where the space was that you could, as a young person, actually have a say. And I know that universities, for instance, as well, have also had big debates about the referendum as well. So that just struck me as being perhaps indicative of some differences that there might be between England and the US. I just want to ask really a couple of questions to finish with. That was obviously one question, what would happen if we did the same research in each country? But I'm really curious, how would the kids in the class get to be young activists? What would we have to do? Given that schools are obsessed with levels, and that's also true in the US, in some parts of the US, where lessons are scripted, where teachers are under enormous kind of pressure to do, page 24 of this textbook on this particular day, thank you, Pearson. What would it actually take for there to be a move away from kind of civility in school to more kind of civic agency? How could schools kind of nurture the civic imagination? And I have to say that, Lysiso does have a kind of crack at that at the end of the book, but I have to say, in the face of things like the discourse of levels and the kind of conservative forces in education, it to me looks pretty kind of Pollyanna-ish. And so I kind of want to raise this as a kind of more political question. I think it is the question that Sonia and Julian have raised as well, is how does that kind of happen? How do, a bunch of pretty ordinary kids, in the class, how might they become kind of more engaged in the world and make the world the kind of place that they want it to be and they imagine it to be?
Thank you.